Ladies and gents, this is the moment you've been waiting for. A podcast for podcasters. This is Creating the Greatest Show, and I'm your host, Casey Cheshire. Join me as we interview podcast hosts and investigate the ingredients of a successful interview podcast. We'll talk mistakes, earned skills, powerful questions, and more. This show is sponsored by Ringmaster, completely done for you B2B podcast production. All right, I hit the button. This has begun. The adventure, it's underway, and we can't turn it back. We can't turn back the hands of time. So let me introduce my guest today. We've already had a podcast worth of conversation already that you didn't get to hear. So we thought maybe we'll hit record so you can hear this part. Man, what a great guy. I can't wait to talk more about this thing that we all love, podcasting with him. Who is he, Casey? Enough about your feelings, more about the guest. He is an entrepreneur, a writer, a creator, a marketing leader, a thought leader. He has a PhD in philosophy and English literature. Let's go. He's been podcasting since 2017, host of the B2B content show and the pod shop, founder and CEO of Connversa. Jeremy Shere, welcome, sir.
Well, thank you so much. And what a wonderful introduction. I just want to correct one thing. I'm not a marketing leader. I mean, I would never describe myself that way just because, I interview real marketing leaders on the B2B content show so I can learn about marketing.
Totally.
But, I would never call myself that, although it's very flattering that you said that. But out of just respect to all the people I've interviewed on that show, they're the marketing leaders. I'm just learning from them. That's all.
Man, I feel the same way about everyone I talk to on this show and even on my marketing podcast. It's amazing the people we get a chance to talk to and learn from. There's some real wizards out there for sure. I don't know if you do this, but I call myself like a caveman with a hammer. I'm not even good with hammers. I'm the one hitting my thumb with it. Right. So, well, hey, let me get to this first question. I can't wait to dive into your thoughts and your answer on this. Yeah. Jeremy, pull back the curtain for us on your show and share your most important strategy for a great interview podcast.
Okay. So, well, maybe let me tell you about the show just a little bit, just to give a little context, because sure. I think, every show is a little bit different, right? And what constitutes a great interview will depend at least partly on what the show is about. So the B2B content show, like that, you mentioned this other show I have called the Pod Shop, but the main one I do and the one that's been going longest is called the B2B content show, all about B2B content marketing. And where, as I mentioned just before, I'm interviewing marketing leaders, heads of content, VPs of marketing, that sort of thing. Yeah. And so this is also a case where, as I just said, I'm, sort of the amateur. I am not a marketing leader. And so as the host of the show, that's kind of how I position myself. Like, I'm learning from you, and I'm hoping that our audience will too. And I'm saying all this because I think that matters in terms of the quality of the show and the quality of the interviews I do. So I think that one super important element of any interview show and what's going to kind of make or break it. I mean, it's honestly hard to pinpoint it down to just one thing, but I'll do my best. So
I know, unfortunately, gunpoint to do that.
Yeah, right. Virtual gunpoint, right? So, one major factor is the host and how good the host is at doing the interview. And I think in order to do that, the host has to understand their own limitations and kind of the perspective that they're coming from. Because if you don't, if the host doesn't have a clear understanding of that, I think it's hard to develop the right kind of rapport with the guest and do an interview that actually just turns into like a free-flowing conversation, and less of a series of questions that are answered. And I find that, becoming a good host, like the art of the interview, it's something that you learn over time with practice. And I think every podcast host will admit, if pushed enough, that, they used to kind of suck at it and now they've gotten better if they've kept up with it. And when you listen back to some of your earlier episodes,
Yeah.
you're like, wow, I've come a long way, or, I'm just much better at this. And the episodes sound a lot better because I've learned, the tricks and the techniques and all that stuff. So I think that's one key. If it's your show, then you need to dedicate yourself to learning the art and science of how to interview people. And if you're producing a show, say for someone else, like we do at Connversa for a company or whatever, then you need to pay quite a bit of attention to who's the host going to be? What kind of training and coaching do they need? Where are they starting from? If they're starting from zero, what kind of natural abilities do they have and what do we need to improve on?
Right.
And I think you can't, in a way that's just, of course, pretty obvious, but I think you can't really talk about it too much. The quality of a host can just make or break an interview show.
When really focusing on it's like the quarterback, right? To throw in a random sports analogy.
Yeah.
My beloved Patriots did so well, and then Tom Brady goes to Florida, and then I don't even know I don't even watch the games lately. So sometimes there are pivotal roles, and in this case, by its very nature, the host is that role. I heard you say something. The host needs to have some sort of sense of where the guest is coming from. What did you mean by that?
So the guest's point of view.
The point of view.
Yeah, I think is the best way to put it. And I think the host has to have a clear understanding of their own point of view too. I think one of the keys to success of any podcast, including an interview show, is that it needs to have a strong point of view. There are so many shows that are just kind of two people talking about stuff, or if it's a B2B podcast, two people discussing important trends in the industry, which is fine. But I think the best shows, what makes them stand out, one thing that makes them stand out is that they have a very distinct point of view.
The show itself or the host does, or both?
Both, because I think those are kind of inseparable. As the host, you're the one articulating that point of view and kind of embodying it, but that your whole show is built around a particular take on whatever your show is about, right?
Yeah.
And then the great content comes when you bring on guests that they might align with that point of view, or sometimes even better, they might not. They were going to bring in a different point of view that's not necessarily opposed to the point of view of the show, like, directly opposed, but it's different enough that you're kind of chopping it up and not always just agreeing. The exchanges are not always like, oh, that's so true, that's a great point. It might be like, well, let me push back on that a little bit. What about this? Or you said this, how do you know that? I think that's where some of the drama and tension can come in an interview show.
So cool.
And so another element here that I think is really important. So number one is having just the best host that you can have, or whoever the host is, having that person dedicated to improving episode by episode. And then the other, another important element is doing prep calls with guests. Okay. I'm a big advocate for that. Okay. And there was a post on LinkedIn just yesterday about this. Not my post, someone else who I don't know, but I participated in the conversation. And the question was kind of like, do you do prep calls or not? Are they important? Or, and this person's point was, they're kind of peeved when instead of a proper prep call, like you and I did for this episode, right? Yeah. Someone just sends you like a Google form with a bunch of questions that you have to fill out.
The form's worse than a PDF, right? At least a PDF is like, but a form, come fill out my form and be on my show. Ooh.
Yeah, it's like, here's some extra work for you to do. That's just like a chore.
Right.
As opposed to the prep call, which you're getting to talk to a real person and have a real conversation. And and it should be the host doing the prep call. And if the host is good at that. And I think there's a whole kind of art and science to doing the prep call as well. But again, it should be friendly, relaxed. You're trying to build rapport. You'll often kind of start talking about the topic and even getting into it in the way that you're going to in the actual interview. Although I think part of the job of the host there is to not go too far down that road. You don't want to, shoot all your bullets in the prep call.
Oh yeah.
But what I really value about prepping with a guest is you come in, maybe with some idea of what you want to talk about or not. Often I don't. I'm like, I want to, let's discuss ideas. Yeah. But the whole point is whether you have some starting idea or not, once you do have some idea, which is usually fairly broad, to explore with the guest, what's the beating heart of this topic? What are the main things that we want to hit? And that's going to really depend. You could bring in, if you had like 3 different guests lined up, they might all have kind of different ways of answering that, different things that they want to focus on, which is good. That means, you could, in my podcast, the B2B Content Show, we've done multiple episodes on kind of the same topic, roughly, but they're all very different because we're focusing on different things, or the particular guest has a particular take on it, right? A particular point of view on it. And so I want to learn what that point of view is. And then when we actually go to record the interview, I've written questions that align with that point of view, that take that into consideration. And I feel prepared as the host to kind of guide and shape the discussion in a way that's going to be the most relevant to the audience, that's going to get right to the heart of the most interesting, engaging part of this topic. And so it's going to be efficient in that way, while all at the same time allowing the conversation to take interesting twists and turns that I didn't anticipate. But at least I'm starting from somewhere very solid. And that way, as a host, and I think this is another crucial skill that a host needs to develop, is no matter how much you plan, during that prep call, when you actually hit record, you're never quite exactly sure how the conversation's going to unspool, right? And a host has to be good at listening on different levels. On the one hand, just listening on the most straightforward level, just what is the guest basically saying? And, so you can be prepared to respond to it and ask follow-up questions. But also listening for, are we kind of sticking to what we had planned to say? Or the guest seems to be going off on a bit of a tangent here. That's interesting. And it's your job as the host in real time to kind of make the call like, okay, do I need to reorient this back to what we had discussed? Or is this tangent actually even more interesting than what we discussed? And we're going to roll with it and kind of let it go as you're listening to the person talk. Yeah. So you have to be thinking about that on the one hand, while you're also processing just what they're saying to you on the other hand. So you have to keep this all in your head as it's happening in real time, and then make those judgment calls throughout the course of the interview. Yeah. I think that's another, crucial skill for a host to have, because at that point, the guest is just talking, they're in the flow. Yeah. They probably don't even realize that they're going off on what you're considering a tangent, but maybe it's a fruitful tangent, or maybe not. Right.
And this is so cool. And this is what I like about this show, is it's so meta, right? Not to be confused with Facebook and armless emojis running around a virtual universe. So we actually had this exact thing happen that you're describing just now with us. So we were chatting about the ideal hosts and a distinct point of view, and agreeing. And there's some things I'm going to circle back to at some point, because I want to dive into that. And then came up the topic of prep calls. And then in my mind, it was, man, I really want to talk about disagreeing with your guests or one of these other things but you know what? You were on a roll, and you were really, explaining some good stuff. Don't want to shoot all the bullets in prep call, how important it is. And I agree with you. Prep call is like vital. It is the thing. And so I wanted to hear your topic and take on that. So I let us just run with it. And what's great is because I did that, we're able to have this real example. And then you were able to talk about how a host needs to allow that to happen. And because I was able to allow that to happen, you were able to make a teaching moment. And then we were able to make this whole thing meta.
There you go, which is a testament.
Wow.
Yeah, which is a testament to your skill as a podcast host.
Oh, cool. Well, thank you. But I love that it all happened, real time. So we can demonstrate,
right,
on a show just as much as so talk to me about corralling. Let's do corralling your guest back on topic if maybe they went off into like frozen yogurt land. But then after that, let's talk about disagreeing.
Okay, sure. So corralling a guest, right?
And kind of like roping them and bringing them back.
I think that, I think for less experienced podcast hosts or any kind of interviewer, this can be an uncomfortable thing.
Yeah.
Especially if the guest is someone like you admire or, someone who's like a big deal, at least in your mind. I mean, I think there are different ways to do this. So one is if the guest is often a bit of a tangent, let it play out. And then, one simple technique is to be like, wow, like that's really, really interesting. But I want to circle back to sort of something we were talking about before. That's a simple way to kind of cut that tangent off, essentially. Like, okay, we're done talking about that now. Let's go back to the main thing that we actually are talking about.
Right.
And, just to kind of do it in that really straightforward way. I mean, I've done interviews before where, and this isn't exactly going off on a tangent, although it could be, but it's a slightly different problem that also requires corralling the guest.
Yeah, please.
When a guest just won't stop talking.
Oh, yeah. You had those?
Oh, yeah. I mean,
wait, that's not you, by the way.
Well, okay. But I mean,
that'd be funny though. Like that's happening right now.
If it turns out that is me, and at some point during this interview, I'm just blabbing on and on, you might feel the need at some point to a little bit jump in and be like, hey, can I jump in for a second here? You said something I want to, that's another thing you have to be able to do as a host is you sometimes get guests that are just talkers. I've had interviews where people start talking before I've even asked a single question or even introduced them.
Yeah.
They just, as soon as we hit record, they're just off and running. I'm like, whoa, okay. They just have a lot to say. And again, you, as the host, you kind of have to judge when might be a good time for me to jump in here.
Yeah.
Because this is now going on a bit too long. Like, we've designated an hour for the interview, let's say, or a half hour. And I have, about 5 questions or whatever I want to get to. We're on question 1 and we're 12 minutes in.
Yeah.
You're also looking at the clock and you're like, okay, I need to jump in here a little bit and kind of, so what I do, and it's pretty rare that this happens, but when I do, I wait for a little bit of a pause. Maybe the person's just taking a breath.
You're right.
And you just have to kind of politely interrupt them and jump in and be like, hey, I just want to jump in here for a second. All this is super interesting. I want to go back to something else you said. And then in that way, kind of reorient things. Because for sure, the guest is not aware of what they're doing. They're not aware that they're going on and on and on in a way that needs to be corralled.
Yeah.
They're not going to magically realize that. You as the host have to do something about it.
I love that we're talking about this, right? This is like the real side of podcasting, right?
Yeah.
I mean, there's fluff and there's all these other things to talk, hey, how great it is. But there's some just real personal challenges where you need to, politely interrupt somebody because they're being a blabbermouth. And I will say one of the things that you don't want to do, you do need to do that at some point. And I have made the mistake of not doing that and then let them talk for feels like 20 minutes. Right. And the worst thing that could happen is I checked out. Right. And I was like,
right.
Maybe I can check my email or something. Like clearly I'm not involved in this conversation. So I'll just let them go. And it's like, that's the worst thing to do is to abdicate control of the show and let them jump in. It's your show. Your responsibility to get in there and fix things.
Yeah, it's sort of a delicate calculus. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
on the one hand, you want the conversations typically to be unscripted, free flowing. You don't
Yeah.
want to put in place too many parameters that narrow that make the guest feel self-conscious, right?
Right.
Or like kind of too that you've too narrowly defined the parameters. Because you want some of those tangents, like we were saying before, can be really good and fruitful.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, you still want the final product to be coherent, cohesive, have a kind of through line. So it's not just all over the place. You know, I've produced episodes for people where I'm thinking of one instance in particular. Of course, I won't name names, where right from the start, I could kind of tell, and I was just like producing, not, it was somebody else was the host. They started in one place, but they just went all over, and it was long. It was like a 45-minute interview, and it came out, and I was like, they touched on like 8 different topics that are all kind of loosely related, but it was just too much. It was just, it wasn't coherent in the way that I prefer interviews to be, that I think interviews are at their best. And again, it's your job as the host to make that happen. It's your
Yeah.
fault if it doesn't. It's
Right.
not the guest's fault. No matter how well you've prepared them, they're going to do what they're going to do, and you have to find ways to, while allowing it to be free form and flowing and all that stuff, at the same time, to be subtly shaping it and
Mm-hmm.
reining stuff in just enough to give it that coherence without killing the spontaneity of it.
Right. Right. And I mean, you owe it to the guests too. I think half of us don't want to offend them, but it's almost more offensive to let them be a lesser version of themselves than to interrupt and bring out the best in them. So really dive in there and get after it. And so I'd love to transition to when you talk about disagreeing and having that strong point of view.
Yeah.
Um, I remembered an experience where I was starting to have that same kind of like mental checkout. Like, this isn't a dialogue. This is
A
this person
monologue.
throwing something at me. And then
Yeah.
they mentioned something in the marketing world where they said, I think you should get rid of all your forms in front of your content.
Mm.
Right. And I'm a big marketing automation guy. And maybe we'll have to like this topic and to the marketing show. But I actually feel the opposite.
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, content the hell out of it, form the hell out of it, but don't make them giant forms. Make them these little tiny little things you barely
Yeah.
even notice. Your browser fills it out for you anyways, right? Like make them very small and efficient is my take. The he had to take, I had to take, and it reinvigorated me, and I was
Yeah.
suddenly interested again. And we had a little back and forth. It was friendly, and I think I might have convinced him. It was good though, and I feel
Right.
like to your point about have a point of view, but talk to me about how you disagree with your guest and you don't make it like a show where it's like a CNN where you're like pouncing on someone. Oh, you're a loser, and actually you're wrong, and here's what it really is. How do you
Yeah.
do that the right way?
Yeah. Great question. So, well, first of all, I think you just described very nicely what not to do. You're not you're not trying to get people, like you're not asking
Yeah.
gotcha questions that they're not prepared for or that put them in a very awkward position, right? That's
Right.
just going to destroy whatever relationship you've built, and it's just uncomfortable. And I think we've all seen enough of that on, in the media to have grown very tired of that kind of thing, because it doesn't result in good content often.
Yeah.
It's just contentious, but you don't really learn anything. It turns into an argument rather than a discussion, right?
Yep.
I think the key to disagreeing, or like having a real discussion from different points of view, like your example about should you gate content or not, right?
Yeah.
That's a great topic. And there are plenty of valid opinions on all sides of that debate, right? So I think number one, the key is it needs to be organic. This shouldn't be something that's forced, like you're deliberately taking an extreme point of view in order to disagree with the guest or something
Right.
like that. I think that it needs to be organic. On the other hand, you might play devil's advocate, but as long as you own it. Be like, playing devil's advocate here for a second, let me push back on that thing that you said,
I like that.
But I think it's best when it's organic and you really do say like, well, I have a different way of looking at that. And I think as long as you keep it, well, I want in one way I want to say polite, but that's not exactly the word. You want to keep it non-contentious, keep it from getting into an actual argument where you're trying to win. Your goal there is you're not trying to win an argument. You're not necessarily trying to persuade the other person that you're right and they're wrong. That's an argument.
Yeah.
Right. A discussion where you disagree. That's where I think actually that's kind of conversation at its best. That's interview at its best. That's when both parties are open to exploring an idea together, batting it around, considering the other person's point of view.
Yeah.
And legitimately challenging their point of view in a respectful and thoughtful way.
Yeah.
So in other words, not just attacking them, personally, or not just saying like, well, that's stupid, or like making it super political or something, but like questioning their premises, or just asking, well, why do you think that? Is there evidence to back up that point of view? And then responding to what they say, asking reasonable questions, sort of poking at an idea in a reasonable, intelligent way. And then sometimes just agreeing to disagree.
Yep.
Again, your point is not to win and like crush your opponent into submission. It's to bat around the idea where hopefully at the end, where you're genuinely curious why the other person thinks the way that they do, with the goal of maybe learning something from them. Maybe it'll change how you think a little bit. Maybe you'll change how they think a little bit. But at the end of the day, ideally, both parties have learned something, have enjoyed the back and forth and the process of trading ideas and sort of, questioning each other a little bit, to pushing a little bit. Like, well, why do you think that? Can you explain your reasoning? That's legit. That's good. That's not gotcha. Mm-hmm. That's just asking a legitimate why question, So that's how I go about it.
Oh, love that. I feel like we could do more of that. Well, to your point though, it has to be organic, right? I think whenever you add in those, I'm going to disagree with you on purpose. I mean, straw mans are interesting, but that doesn't happen that often. I think you and I might tie that all back into a good prep call. It's finding out, oh, I'm going to disagree with you on this. And then you both know it. And then you're both ready.
Yeah, exactly. Like when I'm doing a prep call, especially if we don't already have a topic set, sometimes I'll ask the guest, like, what's something in the world of B2B content marketing that you disagree with, or that you have a contrary take on? And sometimes they'll be like, oh, well, yeah, like, we'll sort of deliberately choose a topic that there's a debate about. And then that way we can get into that. And even if I might have a very similar point of view to the guest, again, you can play devil's advocate a little bit and say like, well, on LinkedIn, there are plenty of people arguing something different. They're saying, actually, it should be this way. What do you think about that? And, that's where I think you get the sparks start to fly a little bit, and you're getting into, and that's part of what creates good content, I think.
Are you creating these questions, all of them from scratch on a prep call? How much is scripted? How much is the same show to show? How much is different?
You mean in terms of the prep call itself?
Oh, I guess even your show format. Do you use a lot of the same questions, or almost
I see.
All of them unscripted?
Yeah, good question. So I do not use the same questions. I start basically fresh with each episode, and I base it pretty much entirely on the prep call and, the other research maybe that I've done. There's some overlap from topic to topic, similar kinds of questions, right? but the details, specifically what the questions are about, is unique.
Mm-hmm.
Because each interview is unique. You know, of course, there are other ways to do this. Another format might be to ask the same set of questions to each person, which can work very well. You know, that way you can sort of build up a body of episodes where you get all kinds of different takes or points of view responding to the same set of questions, and can be interesting for research purposes too, right?
Right. Good for content. Good for
content. It definitely can be. I think that's a totally legitimate way to go about it. I don't do that. It just feels more natural to me to have a unique conversation each time, that I'm trying to peg the questions to what the guest is most interested in and seems to be most passionate about.
Yeah, you're kind of listening for those little moments, either on the prep or even on the show, for those little, oh, that's interesting. We're gonna go down that path. We got to hear that.
Right. And that's another thing that hosts need to do, right? You need to be listening for, like I was saying before, for tangents and should we go there or not. But you're raising another good point. You know, you just have to be listening for moments that, you know, through your experience as a host, that like, that's really interesting. I'm going to dig more into that, even if that wasn't the next question on your list, you know, or it's only coming up now and you didn't think about it before. To be able to judge in real time, let's pursue that point more, because that's a unique way of thinking about that thing, you know, and to drill down on it. Definitely.
Because I've gotten more experienced, I've used the standard questions less and less. Like on the marketing show, I have maybe 4 or 5 that I always ask as almost like a framework to the house. And then in between is me just winging it and having fun and doing follow-up questions. But for this show, I guess maybe it's because I've developed it from the last show. This show, it's like that first question, we started out, and behind the scenes, like I have a list up here of like 20 questions that, I think we reviewed a few of them together on the prep, but may not even get to if these follow-ups all just dance around.
Well, I think that's another element to what makes for a good interview show, is as the host not feeling like you have to get to every question.
Oh, yeah.
Right. And I think starting out, like when you're less experienced, you could, reasonably think that, like, well, I have 10 questions here and we need to get to them because that's what this is about. And you just, it can cause a lot of anxiety, and you might end up then with an episode where you get like very short clipped answers to the 10. And so, you've covered those 10, but you didn't really drill down on anything. And it's more of a surface level sort of survey type content than it is going deeper and really uncovering some new stuff. And I think you learn as a host, the more you go on, that if you have a long list of questions, we're not going to get to all of these in the time allotted,
right.
And that's fine. Or you learn to just keep it to like 5 questions or however many you can reasonably get to in the allotted time. And you just, even though there are many other questions you could ask, you learn to like, well, that could be for another episode. That's okay.
Great
I'm going to keep it. I try to keep things when I'm hosting a show, to keep it very simple and minimal on my end. I want to try to, and again, goes back to the prep call, to try to hone in on like, what are the top 3 or 4 most important or interesting things that we want to hit, and really try to hone in on those with the questions. So I might only have 3 or 4 questions that I want to ask.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think different people's style, some people love the planning, some people love the adapting. Just bring it.
Yeah.
And we need to be able to cater to guests from all walks of life. The ones that, it's fine, I don't need to prep. I just want to, on that note, do you allow people to skip your prep?
That's a really good question. It's actually never come up, believe it or
not.
I have not had a single guest who refused to do the prep call. If
by the way, I can introduce you to a couple that might be great guests on your show. They will absolutely refuse, and I'd love to see the thread in the email of what do you think you would say to them?
Yeah, right. So if that were to happen, I mean, I think I would just roll with it and be like, okay, I would never force anyone to do a prep call. I think I would try to find an alternative,
Okay.
because I mean, the only way that would be completely okay for me is if we have the topic locked in place, and maybe I was able to do enough research to kind of get the gist of where this person is coming from, where the guest is coming from. Maybe they've talked about this on other podcasts or in other, formats. So I'll check that out and at least have some place to start from without talking to them about it. Or I might say like, okay, we don't have to do a prep call, but how about we just do this by email? Like I'll send you a few just quick things, and if you can just respond even just a few lines to orient me, it's hard. I don't think I would be okay with just absolute blind, just show up and let's just talk about some stuff and I'll hit record, because I feel like that's going to be a waste of my time, most likely, and ultimately a waste of the guest time because the episode's not going to be very good.
Mm-hmm.
So I think I would most likely gently push back a little bit and at the very least say, can we do a quick email exchange? And if they even refuse that, I guess I would have to make a judgment call then, and it might come down to a case by case, like, well, then we're just not going to do this. If you can't spare, 15 minutes for a quick prep call or 2 minutes for a quick email exchange, then I'm not sure how interested you are really in doing this with me and creating this good content,
Yeah. I feel like it tends to happen with either more seasoned speakers, more famous people, or people who think, you said this really well, who are famous in your eyes or famous in their eyes, right?
Yeah,
like
right.
Who feel like they might be. I had a former boss of mine, people go check out LinkedIn and try to figure it out. He was like a thought leader, and I wanted to have him on the marketing show, and he said like no to the prep call. For me, I just want to kind of catch up too. And
yeah.
I mean, you're that busy that you can't do that. And so we actually said, well, let's do it another time then. I just, other people I've, like for this show, it's a meta. So okay, great. Don't show up with no prep and let's just see what happens. And we actually talked about it. And Tasha Miller, she was actually fantastic,
Mm-hmm.
but we talked about how she would like flat out refuse to do a prep. And we talked through it, but I feel like just like with forms, there are bad prep calls, and then there are the prep calls that you and I did, and then you do with your guests. And I think a lot of people have that in their mind, the bad ones, which is why they're like, I'm not going to show up for your half-hour hangout sesh.
Right. And look, fair enough. When you reach out and ask someone to be a guest on your show, assuming that you're not paying them, right? They are doing you a favor. They are giving you their time. They could just as easily refuse. And so you really want to make everything as efficient as possible and not waste their time. And so I can understand why some people just might be like, I'll give you my time for the show. I can't do the prep call, all that.
Yeah.
I think maybe the only situation where I'd be 100% okay with that is if the person was a genuine, like, big deal celebrity. And the calculation would be like, okay, I'll probably never have a chance to talk to this person again. They have such a big platform that it's going to help the podcast. There's real value in it for the show because they can help promote it and all that. And okay, if they just refuse a prep call, I'll roll with that because their presence on the show would be so valuable. Yeah. I think that's the only situation where I could justify totally skipping that.
Totally. Like, Seth Godin said no, but had he said yes, I was like, yeah, sure, man. Show up, talk to me about your purple cow. But it's interesting. And this may be like Jedi level for you and I, and maybe no one will follow with us. But the idea of, doesn't it kind of change the power dynamic? Like you said, like they're doing you a favor, but aren't you kind of doing them a favor too? And what I like about it is it's kind of a mutual favor. So when one of these things tips that balance, now it's just like, oh, please come on my show. I want to get your name. And then they're never going to promote your show, but at least you'll have their name on your show. And it gets kind of transactional and weird,
Well, that is a good point. And I agree with you. it's not just a one-way thing, right?
You don't have to technically. You can disagree
right.
with me.
That's right. I completely disagree with you. Every word you said. No, I mean, I agree with you in that yes, they're doing you a favor. I'm not sure I would phrase it that, like, as the podcaster, you're doing them a favor exactly. I think that you're offering them an intriguing opportunity, that there's value in the offer that you're making.
Yeah, better said. I totally agree.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, well said. Yeah.
And they're not, and anyone who accepts that, they're not accepting it just like, oh, I'll do you a favor, like I'll throw you a bone. No, they're accepting it only because they're like, well, okay, actually, this seems like there's something in it for me, something of actual value. I mean, everyone acts that. Everyone is self-interested in that way, and that's not a bad thing. That's just human nature. That's just how people are. But I think that's what can make podcasting such a valuable, like, business strategy, right? I had another guy, shout out to Mark Evans, if he happens to hear this episode, a guy I know from LinkedIn and I've had on the B2B content show. He had me on his show called Marketing Spark. And he had a great way of putting this, which is that podcasting is like digital catnip. It's very hard to resist the allure of, like, oh, you want to feature me on your podcast? Who isn't at least a little intrigued by that, to be featured in some media. I mean, it's attractive. It's like a compliment, so it's just a really good way to get a yes from someone and to get some time with them and to get to know them a little bit. It doesn't always work. Like, you said Seth Godin declined. And so, sure, not everyone's going to say yes, but a lot of people will, especially people who are not famous, and don't often get the opportunity to share their thoughts, and speak their mind. You're going to get a lot of yeses. And if you're a B2B, and you can get yeses from people that you want to talk to, that your organization needs to get to know, then that's a good thing.
Yeah.
That's a very valuable thing. And so, but you mentioned power dynamic, and that's an interesting idea, and I think an important one that I've thought about quite a bit. And I think there is a balance of power between the host and the guest of a podcast that shifts over time. So I think when you initially reach out to someone, especially to someone you don't know, asking them to be a guest in your podcast, the power rests mostly with the guest because they can say yes or no.
Right.
In fact, they have the full power to either agree, sure, I'll come on, or no, I will not come on your show. And that's fine. Once they agree, if they do agree, once they do that and they commit to giving you their time, the power immediately shifts to the host, because the guest is essentially putting themselves in your hands, and they are trusting you to lead them down the path so that you are properly prepared to be a good guest, that when you show up, you are ready to talk and be interesting and engaging, and you're trusting them to not make you look stupid. That's everyone's fear.
Yeah.
Right. That's that at the end of the day, you're going to edit and cut this in a way that's not what they were expecting, and that can be damaging to their personal brand, or, whatever you want to call it. So they are trusting you. So now as the host, you have quite a bit of power, and with power comes responsibility, as Spider-Man, as we all know from the Spider-Man, movies or comic books. And you have a responsibility to the guests to be professional and make them, and have a great conversation, create good content with them. And to, if you're gonna challenge them, like we were talking about before, to do it in a professional and respectful way, all that stuff. So I think that's how I see it. The power dynamic, it really shifts. And it doesn't matter who the guest is. The guest might be a quote unquote powerful person, like in their organization. They might be a CEO. Mm-hmm. They might be a C-suite person. And I've talked to plenty of these types of people, and I'm just a, lowly podcast host,
Sure.
But once they've agreed to do it, they're in my hands, and that's the vibe, and they trust you. And so you have to be careful with that as the host. You have to live up to it.
Doesn't it
But
kind of
if
seem
you
like dancing to you? Like, because I feel like once you're recording, it's almost mutual, right? It's almost mutual, but I'm going to ask some questions. And if we finish a question, you're going to look at me and go, okay, what's the next one? You're
yeah,
probably not going to be like, well, here's another question you haven't asked me yet that I'm just going to start answering. I mean, some people might do that, like you mentioned earlier, but
right.
typically it's like I'm leading, but man, are we just, I don't know if have you done like dancing lessons where they
Yeah,
make you like sort of just, I'm just going to move and you're moving with me. And no one's really forcing anyone to do anything. I'm just saying,
right.
let's go this way now. And we're just going together.
Right. Well, absolutely. Right. And like, as someone who is not good at dancing, like I'm athletic enough and like can play sports and that, but when it comes to dancing, I'm just super self-conscious. Whereas my wife is a good dancer. And the point is that it's like, yeah, when two people who are good dancers are dancing, you're like, wow, they just flow together. It's like it just seems so natural, but it's actually choreographed, right? And I think a podcast interview is a little bit the same way. That you're right, that like once you hit record, I think the power dynamic kind of levels out. You're both at the table, maybe the virtual table, like we're doing right now.
Chit chat.
And then it's kind of a meeting of equals. The guest has done their part. They've consented to be on this show. They've showed up. They did the prep call. You've done your part as the host, that you've prepared and you've written your questions and maybe shared them and you're ready to go. And then once you hit record, yeah, let the games begin. And if everyone's done their job well, then it turns into a really good conversation and the time flies. And a guest that might have been a bit nervous at the outset, and I've had plenty of those, and they often will just admit it, be like, I'm a little nervous. And I always tell them, that's fine, totally natural, especially if you haven't done a lot of these types of interviews. But I can guarantee you, once I hit record and we just start talking, you'll forget that we're doing an interview. You'll forget there's a mic in front of you. You'll just talk because we'll just get caught up in what we're talking about. And that's true pretty much every time.
Yeah, love that. Where can people reach out? I feel like I could talk to you all day. We'll probably have to schedule some more of these things so we can just spend an hour on power dynamic and all these other cool concepts. Where can people, they want to reach out on content, B2B content, on podcasting, and all the things? Where do you want them to go?
Yeah. So, well, a couple of places. I am on LinkedIn, of course.
Hey, LinkedIn, tell me about this. What's this website?
Oh, it's this new up and coming website. You should check it out. I think it might catch on. Yeah. Jeremy Shere on LinkedIn, last name Shere. So you can find me there. I'm on it pretty much every day. You can email me. I'm Jeremy at Connversa.com. That's CONN Versa.com. And if you go to our website, Connversa.com, you can, find contact information there as well. So, yeah, always open for a conversation. Always happy to meet new people. So reach out.
Love it. Love it. And apparently, shout out to Mark Evans that you mentioned earlier. We're literally recording tomorrow on this show. So
oh, no way.
So we'll give him a shout out and we'll tell him to listen to this episode. And I'm sure on his tomorrow that we'll.
Okay. Well, yeah, please tell Mark I say hello.
I will. That's small awesome. World, right? It really is.
Right.
Man. Well, Jeremy, thank you so much for coming on here. To be able to geek out with a fellow wizard like this for an hour on these concepts that are way above just hitting the button and hitting record and letting it ride. Like, this has been so much fun. So thank you for coming on here.
Well, thank you. This was a lot of fun. And I want to say publicly on the show that I think you are an excellent host, a great podcast host, because we did the prep call and it was, and beyond just that, we had a substantive conversation and kind of prepared. We just got to know each other a bit and it was enjoyable.
Yeah.
And that's something I don't know if you can learn that. Either you're good at a conversation and just being friendly and open with people, or you're not, and you are really good at making the prep call and this experience doing the interview like fun and engaging. And that's so important. It's really important for good content. So thank you.
Oh man, I appreciate that. That is really great to hear. I just love doing it. So I'm glad that my skills have caught up to my passion and I'm learning something from the people I talk to. So very cool. And in a fun segue to those listening, if you learned something and I freaking know you did because I literally have 2 pages of notes over here, front and back, then share this episode with someone else. 1 person, 9 people, 3,000 people. That's thought leadership, getting good information into other people's hands. And with that, man, thanks again, dude. I appreciate you.
Thank you.
All right, everyone. This has been a crazy episode of Creating the Greatest Show. We will catch you all next time. And next time doesn't have to be next week. Life's too short, and we have way too much to talk about. Find show notes full of takeaways, lessons, and links at creatingthegreatestshow.com. For more information on launching your own podcast or working with us to produce your existing show, come on down to the big tent at ringmaster.com. Until then, friends, whatever you do, do it with all your might. Work at it, if necessary, early and late, in season and out of season, not leaving a stone unturned and never deferring for a single hour that which can be done just as well now. P.T. Barnum.